J.K. Rowling wrote a series of books you might have heard about. In these books, there was a villain who filled people with so much fear that they wouldn't dare say his name. He was referred to only as he who must not be named, or you know who. When the protagonist, Harry Potter, talked to a great wizard named Dumbledore about he who must not be named, Dumbledore says to Harry, "Call him Voldemort. Always use the proper name for things. Fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself." While the church, and the progressive church in particular, have made great strides in bringing many important issues to the forefront, mental illness is one issue in which we have lagged. While there is increased openness on many topics, this topic is still taboo. It is our Voldemort. It is the issue that must not be named. Well, today it is named and it will be said aloud. We will no longer be fearful of naming mental illness, of acknowledging it, and talking about it. The church is the body of Christ. We are the physical manifestation of Jesus' presence on earth. We represent and reflect God to the world around us, and we represent that same God to each other. Church should be a community where people can bring their authentic, hurting, and broken selves, and where everyone can find rest, comfort, and support. We, the church, should be a community where no one ever feels that they have to leave their pain and burdens outside the door. Unfortunately, far too many churches have taken their cues from the world and treated mental illness as Voldemort. We have ignored, marginalized, and at times laughed at the mentally ill. We have been far too silent, and in so doing, contributed to their isolation and shame. And when the church is silent, when we are silent to a person with mental illness and silent to their family and friends, it not only contributes to their suffering, it can also sound remarkably like silence from God. So what do we know about mental illness in society? We know that mental illness is everywhere, and almost everyone will be affected by it in their lifetime. We know that mental disorders are the #1 cause of disability in North America. We know that every year about 1 in 5 adults will suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder, and 1 in 5 children. And we know that 1 in 17 adults has to live with a chronic mental illness. What do we know about mental illness in the church? In one major survey, 98% of church leaders said they knew about people in their congregation suffering from mental illness. Only 12% of leaders ever discussed the issue openly. 50% of congregants said that mental illness wasn't mentioned more than once a year in their church, if it was even mentioned at all. 60% of people and their families who were affected by mental illness wanted to talk openly about it in church, but almost all of them felt they couldn't be open. They felt left out, they felt the church didn't care, and they heard the silence. Of course, they would feel this way, because when mental illness is discussed by a lot of Christians, far too often these are the messages that are given. Mental illness is simply a spiritual disorder. Someone must be simply weak in spirit or have a lack of faith, so it must be treated spiritually. Mental illness is caused by demonic possession. While some people might raise an eyebrow to that idea, in one survey, 19% said possession by evil forces was a cause of mental illness. Some people say mental illness is a punishment for sin. Health and happiness are a sign of God's favor, so if someone is mentally ill, they must have just simply disobeyed God. Mental illness is the fault of the person who is ill. So if the person just pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and stopped complaining, they would be okay. Mental illness has a look to it. So if someone doesn't look sick, they must not really be sick. Mental illness is something to be feared, so we must marginalize those with mental illness and treat them as a source of entertainment, subject matter for jokes, or someone to be feared. So let me state clearly now from the pulpit that none of this is true. Mental illness is not a spiritual disorder. It is not a sign of lack of faith. It is not caused by demon possession. It is not a character flaw. Mental illness is not a punishment for sin. Finding Jesus will not suddenly cure anyone. Mental illness is an illness. Mental illness is a medical condition. Mental illness is an illness with biological and environmental causes, just like a lot of other diseases. But is it any wonder with this type of stigma that people wouldn't want to speak out? That people wouldn't want to tell their stories or ask for help? Is it any wonder that they would want to continue to hide alone? Our text today from Mark is a good example of some of what I've been talking about. Reading this story, most of us today would say that the man probably has some form of mental illness. In light of that, churches could be preaching about the torment the man is in. He has a real medical need, but is banished by the villagers for something they don't understand. Churches could be preaching about the toll mental illness can take on friends and family by looking at the actions of the villagers. They really do try to protect him and them the best they can, but they're at their wits' end and they don't know what to do. Churches could be using this story to open a dialogue and to start talking about mental illness, but sadly that rarely happens. What usually is done with this story is to either stigmatize those with mental illness by telling them their faith is too weak or is caused by a demon on the one hand, or completely ignore mental illness on the other hand, and look at the demons in our own lives, such as selfishness or jealousy. We either give bad theological answers, or we give listeners the message that mental illness isn't to be mentioned. So why would someone risk God's rejection, or the rejection of family and friends, by telling their stories when these are the messages we continually give them? So where do we start? How do we allow space for all of those in our church communities to be able to feel that this is a place for the broken and that this is a place where they can be their authentic selves? We start by talking. We start by talking openly. We start by sharing our stories with each other, so I'll start by sharing mine. I am part of the 1 in 5 adults that has suffered a bout with mental illness. For me, everything fell apart one winter when I was in seminary pursuing my Master of Divinity degree. But the story started long before. My mother died when I was 4 years old, so my memories of that time always consisted of an ambulance coming to the door, taking her away, and a few days later, my father simply telling me she was never coming back. Being 4, I didn't understand. I thought she was coming back eventually, but when she didn't, I thought I must have done something to send her away. As I got older, I understood the concept of death, but I didn't understand hers. I didn't know how she died or anything about her. People thought it would be easier if she was forgotten, so a conspiracy of silence prevailed. Pictures were put away and her name wasn't to be mentioned. While in seminary, I was in therapy to discuss bouts of depression that I had been living with on and off for much of my life. Though they weren't debilitating, I knew it wasn't how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. So of course in therapy, issues emerged around my mother's death, particularly since I had just turned the age at which she had died. I needed to know how she died because the cheap answer of everything happens for a reason wasn't good enough any longer. What I found out I wasn't prepared for. My mother had taught Sunday school. She had dedicated me when I was an infant and felt it was important to have God as the center of her family's life. It also turned out that when she was depressed back in the 70s, she went to her pastor for help, and he made her another woman in his stream of affairs. Their affair turned out to be the incident that began a string of events that led to her accidental suicide. When I found out the truth that had been hidden for so many years, my brain couldn't process it. I didn't know what to do or who to blame, so my brain reacted by cycling every few hours. I would go from being manic to being incredibly depressed over and over and over. However, I was very lucky that I was in a supportive environment. I was lucky that I could check myself into a hospital. I was lucky that I found drugs at the time that leveled me out so I could do some hard work in therapy. I was lucky to be able to find a very good therapist, and I was lucky to be able to afford therapy. What I did realize from my experience is that we as church can't take mental illness away, but we can do better as church. We as church can extend the humanizing, loving friendship that every hurting person needs. We as church can remember that those with mental illness are not only just like us, in many cases they are us. We as church, whether or not we have ever suffered from a mental illness, need to remember that all of our basic needs are the same. We need to have the feeling of acceptance of our community, to have responsibility, to have the opportunity to contribute, and to experience God's presence in our lives. Now I know that this is all easy to say. I know that we live in a culture of quick solutions, and when it comes to mental illness, too many are expecting a short, easy fix. People think to themselves, if only that person would simply pray harder. If only that person would simply read the Bible more. If only that person could just have more faith. If only that person read this book that cured my cousin. If only that person tried a certain vitamin. If only that person would just choose to wake up every day with the right attitude. Then that person could just cure themselves. I also know that we feel unqualified to help people manage and treat mental illness. And in a church community, except for those members who are professionally qualified, we absolutely should feel that way. However, we are qualified to love those with a mental illness. We are qualified to not stigmatize those going for counseling and taking medication. We are qualified to stop spiritual lies when we see or hear them. The reality is every church is full of broken and wounded people because we are all broken and wounded. So it is time for all of us as church to stop lagging. It is time for all of us as church to lead the way. It is time for all of us as church to be more like the church we are called to be. So when anyone walks through our door, they will not feel condemned for their suffering or afraid to share their pain, but instead, they will find a place to tell their story. They will find a place where people will listen. They will find a place in which they feel loved. They will find a place to call home. Amen.